The moment Sheriff Silas Vance rode into Whispering Creek, a hush fell over the dusty main street of the frontier town. It was the summer of 1875, and the scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden storefronts and saloons. Women paused mid-conversation, their eyes following his tall figure atop the impressive black stallion. Men nodded respectfully, already having heard tales of his fast draw and unwavering sense of justice that had tamed 3 lawless towns before this one. Silas was 32, broad-shouldered with eyes the color of a thunderstorm. His reputation had preceded him not just as a lawman who could outshoot any outlaw, but as a man whose rare smile had broken hearts across the Western territories. He tipped his hat politely at the onlookers, but kept his expression neutral as he made his way to the sheriff's office. On the opposite end of town, Penelope Valentine wiped sweat from her brow as she hammered the final nail into the freshly painted sign above her new shop. "Valentine's Apothecary and Books," it declared in elegant lettering. At 26, Penelope had traveled alone from Boston after her parents' passing, determined to build a new life with her knowledge of medicine and passionate love of literature. "You're going to fall and break your neck," called a friendly voice from below. Prudence Miller, the town seamstress, stood with her hands on her hips, squinting up at Penelope. "I'm nearly finished," Penelope replied, carefully descending the ladder. Her dark auburn hair was coming loose from its practical bun, and her simple blue dress was smudged with paint. "Well, you picked quite the day to finish your sign," Prudence said with a meaningful look. "The new sheriff just rode in. Every unmarried woman in town is probably putting on her best dress as we speak." "Is that so?" Penelope replied distractedly, examining her handiwork. "Well, I hope he's good at his job. This town could use some proper law enforcement." Prudence laughed. "Oh, honey, you haven't seen him yet. Sheriff Vance is the kind of man that makes a woman forget all about propriety. Mark my words, by Sunday's church service, half the congregation will be wearing their finest just to catch his eye." Penelope smiled politely, but felt no curiosity. After escaping a controlling fiancé, back east a man chosen by her father for his business connections rather than any affection, she had little interest in men, especially those who drew attention wherever they went. Her focus was entirely on establishing her business and independence. That evening, Mayor Harrington hosted a welcome dinner for the new sheriff. The town's prominent citizens gathered at the Grand Hotel dining room, decorated with fresh wildflowers and lit by gleaming chandeliers, the finest establishment in Whispering Creek. Silas entered the room in a clean black suit, his star pinned to his vest. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his dark hair, but his serious expression remained. The mayor's wife immediately took his arm, introducing him to everyone with undisguised pride, as though she'd personally brought this impressive specimen to town. "And you simply must meet the Wallace sisters, Mrs." Harrington gushed, leading him toward 3 elegantly dressed women who immediately straightened their postures. "Finest family in the county, Sheriff." Silas nodded politely through each introduction, maintaining a respectful distance that somehow only increased the fluttering attention from the ladies present. He answered questions about his previous postings with minimal detail, deflecting inquiries about his personal life altogether. "Sheriff Vance tracked down the Sutton gang single-handedly," Mayor Harrington announced proudly to the assembled guests. 3 men who'd robbed banks across 2 territories. 4, actually, Silas corrected quietly, though I had help from 2 rangers on the final capture. The door opened, and several heads turned as Penelope Valentine entered, looking slightly flustered. She wore a simple but well-tailored green dress, her hair arranged more neatly than it had been while hanging her sign, though a few rebellious curls framed her face. "I apologize for my tardiness, Mayor," she said, approaching their host. "I had to finish an order of medicine for Mrs. Greeley's infant." "Miss Valentine," Mayor Harrington boomed, "come meet our new sheriff. Miss Valentine has only been with us for 2 months, Sheriff. She's opened an apothecary and bookshop. Quite unusual for a lady, but we're fortunate to have someone with medical knowledge." Silas turned, and for the first time that evening, his expression shifted subtly. His eyes widened slightly as they met Penelope's direct gaze, a clear, intelligent look that wasn't hidden behind fluttering lashes or coy smiles. "Miss Valentine," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "Sheriff Vance," she replied, shaking his hand firmly as an equal rather than offering her fingertips daintily as most ladies would. "I'm pleased Whispering Creek finally has proper law enforcement. She speaks her mind, this one," the mayor chuckled nervously. "Good," Silas said simply, his eyes still on Penelope. "Honesty saves time." The dinner proceeded with elaborate courses served by the hotel staff. Silas found himself seated between the mayor's wife and the eldest Wallace sister, both competing for his attention with stories and questions. Across the table, Penelope was engaged in conversation with the town doctor, discussing the properties of willow bark for fever reduction. "You dance, Sheriff?" asked Eliza Wallace, touching his arm lightly. "Not well, madam," Silas replied. "Oh, surely you're being modest." "The spring social is next week, and everyone will attend," Mrs. Harrington added. Silas nodded noncommittally, his attention drawn to Penelope's animated discussion with the doctor. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke, her eyes bright with intelligence. "Don't waste your time with that one," whispered Eliza Wallace, following his gaze. "She's peculiar. Lives above her shop, alone with her books and herbs, barely socializes." Silas didn't respond, but something in his jaw tightened slightly. The following morning, Silas was familiarizing himself with the town's layout when he noticed smoke rising from behind Valentine's apothecary. He approached quickly, hand on his gun, but relaxed when he rounded the corner to find Penelope tending to a small fire behind her shop, carefully adding dried plants to a metal pot suspended above the flames. "Morning, Sheriff," she called without looking up. "No need for concern." "Just preparing tinctures." "Miss Valentine," he greeted, removing his hand from his weapon. "Unusual method. Some medicines require slow heating outdoors. The scent would overwhelm the shop," she explained, stirring the mixture. "How are you finding our little town?" "Quieter than my last posting," Silas said, removing his hat briefly to wipe his brow. "Though I suspect it has its share of troubles beneath the surface." Penelope gave him an appraising look. "Perceptive of you. The Harringtons like to pretend everything's perfect, but we've had problems with cattle rustlers taking advantage of the 3 months without a sheriff." "I've heard rumors," he acknowledged. "Planning to start patrols tonight." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Shopkeepers have been nervous, Mr. Parker's general store was broken into twice." Silas watched as she efficiently worked with her herbs. "You seem well established for someone who's only been here 2 months." "I work quickly," she replied. "And people need medicine regardless of how long I've been in town." She looked up at him directly. "Just as they need protection, regardless of how handsome the protector might be." Silas actually smiled, then a small, surprised expression that transformed his face. "Is that what they're talking about?" "What else?" Penelope said frankly. "Though I imagine you're accustomed to it." "Doesn't mean I encourage it," he replied, replacing his hat. "Good day, Miss Valentine. Be careful with your fire." As Silas walked away, he found himself intrigued by the forthright woman and her lack of pretense. It was refreshingly different from the calculated attention he typically received. Over the next week, Silas established himself in Whispering Creek. He organized regular patrols, met with local ranchers about the rustling problems, and made his presence known in the saloons where trouble typically started. Whispers followed him everywhere, the unmarried women of the town finding excuses to cross his path, bringing baked goods to the sheriff's office or lingering near the jail to catch his eye. Silas remained unfailingly polite, but maintained his distance. The only person he seemed to seek out was Penelope Valentine, stopping by her shop to inquire about remedies for his horse's strained leg or discussing the town's concerns. On Friday afternoon, just as Penelope was closing up, 3 riders thundered into town. Silas emerged from the sheriff's office immediately, hand resting on his holster as the men dismounted outside the saloon. "Who are they?" Penelope asked, pausing beside him on the boardwalk. "Trouble," Silas answered grimly. "Wyatt Decker and his brothers. They were causing problems in Cottonwood before I left. Looks like they followed me here." "What kind of problems?" she asked. "The violent kind," he said. "Stay inside, Miss Valentine." Instead of retreating, Penelope crossed the street toward her shop but remained on the porch, watching as Silas approached the 3 men. They were rough-looking, dusty from the trail, with matching sneers as they spotted the sheriff. "Vance," called the tallest one, presumably Wyatt. "Fancy seeing you here." "Decker," Silas replied evenly. "Whispering Creek's a peaceful town. I suggest you boys water your horses and move on." Wyatt laughed, looking around at the gathering crowd. "Now that ain't friendly. We just rode a long way. Thought we'd rest up, maybe enjoy some company." His eyes lingered on a group of young women watching from the millinery shop. "One night," Silas said firmly. "No trouble. You're gone by morning." The tension was palpable as the men stared each other down. Finally, Wyatt shrugged. "Sure thing, Sheriff. We're just looking for a drink and a meal." No harm in that. Silas didn't move as the Decker brothers pushed through the saloon doors. Only then did he cross to Penelope's shop. "I thought I asked you to stay inside," he said quietly. "You suggested it," she corrected. "I decided against it. Those men seem dangerous." "They are," Silas confirmed. "Keep your doors locked tonight." That evening, Silas sat in a corner of the saloon, nursing a single whiskey as he kept his eyes on the Decker brothers. They were drinking heavily and growing louder by the hour, intimidating the piano player into performing songs they requested and making inappropriate comments to the saloon girls. Near midnight, the youngest Decker brother, clearly intoxicated, stumbled toward the batwing doors. "Going to get some air," he slurred to his brothers. Silas watched him leave, then noticed Wyatt and the middle brother exchanging meaningful looks before they resumed their poker game. Something wasn't right. He waited a few minutes before casually stepping outside, scanning the quiet street. There was no sign of the youngest Decker. Silas checked the alley beside the saloon, then methodically began checking between buildings, hand on his gun. As he approached the apothecary, he noticed the back door was ajar, a faint light visible inside. Drawing his pistol, Silas pushed the door open silently. He moved through the storeroom into the main shop area, where he found young Decker rifling through Penelope's cash box behind the counter. "That's far enough," Silas said coldly. The man whirled, reaching for his gun, but froze when he saw Silas already had him covered. "I was just looking for some medicine for my headache," he stammered. "In the cash box," Silas replied. "Hands where I can see them." Before the standoff could progress, a sharp blow struck Silas from behind. He staggered but didn't fall, turning to find the middle Decker brother had entered through the front door. The moment's distraction was enough for the younger brother to draw his gun. "Drop it, Sheriff," growled the newcomer, his own pistol pointed at Silas's chest. Upstairs, Penelope woke to the sound of voices below. She slipped from her bed and reached for the small derringer her father had insisted she keep for protection. Silently, she crept to the top of the stairs that led down to her shop. "You Deckers never could do anything honestly," Silas was saying, still holding his gun despite the threat. "Was this your plan all along? Rob the town while pretending to just be passing through?" "Wyatt thought we should wait until tomorrow night, but I saw an opportunity," replied the middle brother. "This fancy shop's gotta have decent money. Lady who runs it dresses too fine not to have cash." Penelope slowly descended one step, then another, trying to get a better view. In the dim light, she could see Silas standing between the two brothers, outnumbered but unflinching. "Where's Wyatt?" Silas asked, keeping the bartender distracted. "He'll be along soon enough when we don't come back." The man gestured with his gun. "Now drop your weapon or this gets messy." Penelope stepped on a creaky floorboard, and 3 sets of eyes snapped toward the stairs. In that split second of distraction, Silas dropped to one knee and fired at the middle brother, hitting him in the shoulder. The younger Decker panicked and fired wildly, his shot going high as Silas tackled him to the ground. "Miss Valentine, stay back," Silas shouted as he struggled with the younger man. Instead, Penelope rushed to her counter and grabbed a small brown bottle. As the wounded Decker began to rise, cursing in pain, she threw the contents of the bottle directly into his face. He screamed, clawing at his eyes as the burning liquid did its work. Silas managed to subdue the younger brother with a solid punch, then quickly disarmed the blinded man who was still howling in agony. "What did you throw at him?" Silas asked, breathing heavily as he collected their weapons. "Diluted capsicum extract," Penelope replied, surprisingly calm. "It won't cause permanent damage, but he won't see clearly for hours." Heavy footsteps pounded on the boardwalk outside, and the door burst open to reveal Wyatt Decker, his face contorted with rage at the sight of his brothers captured. "Don't," Silas warned, his gun trained steadily on Wyatt's chest. "It's over." For a tense moment, it seemed Wyatt might draw anyway. Then, recognizing the determination in Silas's eyes, he slowly raised his hands. By morning, all 3 Decker brothers were locked in Whispering Creek's jail, and the story of the night's events had spread throughout town. Penelope found herself receiving visits from concerned neighbors and curious townsfolk alike, all wanting to hear firsthand about the brave apothecary who had helped capture dangerous criminals. "You should have seen Miss Valentine," Mrs. Miller told anyone who would listen. "Cool as can be, throwing some concoction right in that outlaw's eyes. And the way Sheriff Vance protected her shop, why, it's like something from a novel." The spring social was transformed into a celebration of the town's safety, with the mayor making a speech praising both Silas and Penelope for their bravery. The entire town gathered in the decorated town hall, with tables of food around the perimeter and a small band playing cheerful tunes. Silas arrived late, having waited for the U.S. Marshal to collect the Decker brothers for transport to the territorial court. He stood uncomfortably at the entrance, nodding at the many congratulatory comments directed his way. His eyes, however, searched the crowd until he spotted Penelope in a corner, deep in conversation with the schoolteacher. Unlike most women present in their brightly colored gowns with elaborate bustles and trimmings, Penelope wore a simple dress of deep blue that complemented her auburn hair. She looked up as if sensing his gaze, and a small smile formed on her lips. Before Silas could make his way to her, he was intercepted by the Wallace sisters and their mother, all expressing their relief at his heroism, and insisting he tell them every detail of the confrontation. Similar interruptions continued throughout the evening as townsfolk vied for his attention, particularly the unmarried women who seemed even more determined to catch his eye after his display of courage. Across the room, Penelope was similarly besieged by well-wishers and curious questioners. Several young men who had barely acknowledged her existence before now asked her to dance, clearly impressed by her unexpected bravery. It was well into the evening before Silas finally managed to approach Penelope as she stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. "Miss Valentine," he said, joining her on the small porch behind the town hall, "I haven't had a chance to properly thank you for your assistance the other night." "No thanks necessary, Sheriff," she replied. "It was my shop being robbed after all." "Most people would have hidden upstairs," he said. "You showed considerable courage." "As did you," she countered. "Facing 3 armed men alone was either very brave or very foolish." Silas chuckled. "Perhaps a bit of both." He leaned against the railing beside her, looking out at the star-filled sky. "You've made quite an impression on the town." "So have you," Penelope replied with a small smile. "I believe every unmarried woman in Whispering Creek is plotting how to become Mrs. Sheriff Vance. And half the men in there suddenly find themselves interested in literature and medicine," he observed wryly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Silas spoke again, his voice softer. "I'm not one for dancing, as I mentioned before, but I wonder if you might accompany me on a ride tomorrow. There's a spot by the creek I discovered during patrol that reminds me of a place I knew as a boy." Penelope looked at him, noting the uncharacteristic uncertainty in his expression. "I'd like that," she said simply. The following afternoon, they rode out of town together, ignoring the curious glances and whispers that followed them. Silas led Penelope to a peaceful bend in the creek where ancient cottonwood trees provided shade and wildflowers dotted the grassy bank. As they spread a blanket on the ground for their picnic, Penelope asked about his past, not the exploits that had made him famous, but about the boy who had known a place like this one. "My father was a rancher in Colorado," Silas explained, more talkative than anyone in town had ever heard him. "Not a big spread, but enough to support us. My mother died when I was 8, and after that, I spent most of my time exploring the land around our property. There was a creek much like this one where I'd go to think." "What happened to the ranch?" Penelope asked gently. Silas's expression darkened slightly. "Raiders during the war. I was 15, away hunting, came back to find everything burned." He paused. "That's when I decided to learn to use a gun properly. Spent years tracking down the men responsible." "And did you find them?" "Eventually," he said, his voice flat. "Discovered the last one was already in prison for other crimes. Sitting there watching him behind bars, I realized vengeance hadn't brought me any peace." He looked at her directly. "That's when I decided to become a lawman instead." Thought maybe preventing others from suffering might mean more than revenge. Penelope nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you keep to yourself? Why you don't encourage the attention you receive?" Silas considered this. "Partly," he admitted. "Also because most people don't see me, they see the stories they've heard. The reputation, not the man." "I think I understand that," Penelope said softly. "When I arrived here, people saw only what they expected, an unusual woman alone, therefore someone to be either pitied or viewed with suspicion." "What brought you all the way from Boston?" Silas asked. Penelope picked a wildflower, twirling it between her fingers. "My parents died within months of each other last year. My father had arranged my marriage to his business partner, a man 30 years my senior, who saw me as an acquisition rather than a person." She met Silas's eyes. "I left the night before the wedding with my inheritance and what knowledge I had." Decided to go somewhere I could be useful and independent. Brave decision, Silas commented. Necessary one, she corrected. I couldn't live a life chosen for me by others. Their conversation flowed easily after that, discovering shared interests in books and nature. As the afternoon progressed, Silas found himself laughing more than he had in years, while Penelope felt a connection she hadn't expected to find in this frontier town. When they finally rode back at sunset, something had undeniably shifted between them. Over the next several weeks, Whispering Creek watched with interest as Sheriff Vance made daily visits to the apothecary. Sometimes, he brought her wildflowers or plants he thought might be useful for her medicines. Other times, he simply sat in a chair by the counter, reading one of her books while she worked. The Wallace sisters and several other hopeful women continued their efforts to attract his attention, bringing cookies and pies to his office or creating problems that required the sheriff's personal assistance. Silas remained unfailingly polite, but increasingly spent his free time with Penelope. They developed a routine of Sunday afternoon rides, exploring the countryside around Whispering Creek. During one such outing in late spring, they stopped atop a hill overlooking the town. I received a letter yesterday, Penelope said as they sat side by side watching clouds drift overhead. From my former fiancé in Boston. Silas tensed beside her. What did he want? To inform me that he's coming west on business and intends to collect me, she replied with a grim smile. He considers my departure a temporary tantrum and believes I'll see reason when faced with the limited options for a woman alone on the frontier. When will he arrive? Silas asked, his voice carefully controlled. The letter was dated 6 weeks ago. He could be here any day. Penelope turned to face him directly. I have no intention of returning with him, but he's a powerful man used to getting his way. Silas took her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. You're not alone, Penelope. Not anymore. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it wasn't lost on either of them. She smiled, squeezing his hand in return. 3 days later, a private stagecoach arrived in Whispering Creek, drawing attention with its fine craftsmanship and matched team of horses. From it emerged Howard Blackwell, a portly man in his 50s dressed in an expensive suit that looked ridiculously formal in the dusty frontier town. He headed directly to Valentine's apothecary, where Penelope was assisting Mrs. Jenkins with a remedy for her arthritis. The bell above the door jingled, and Penelope looked up to find her past standing in her carefully built present. Penelope, my dear, Blackwell said, removing his hat. You've led me on quite a chase. Mrs. Jenkins looked between them curiously as Penelope straightened her shoulders. Mr. Blackwell, this is unexpected. Is it? He replied with a condescending smile. Surely you knew I wouldn't simply let you disappear with your father's money and my good name tarnished. Your remedy will be ready tomorrow, Mrs. Jenkins, Penelope said calmly to her customer. Would you excuse us? After the older woman left, throwing a concerned glance over her shoulder, Penelope faced her unwelcome visitor. There's nothing to discuss, Howard. I'm not returning to Boston. Don't be absurd, he scoffed. Look at you playing shopkeeper in this primitive settlement. This little adventure has gone on long enough. This isn't an adventure, Penelope replied firmly. This is my life, the one I've chosen. Blackwell's expression hardened. You have no choice, my dear. Your father's will was quite clear. The inheritance you absconded with reverts to my control if you refuse to honor our engagement. That's not true, Penelope said, though uncertainty flickered across her face. Isn't it? I have the documents with me. He reached into his coat. Your father was a clever businessman who anticipated your independent streak. Before he could produce the papers, The shop door opened again, and Silas stepped inside. He assessed the situation immediately, noting Penelope's rigid posture and the stranger's imperious bearing. "Everything all right, Miss Valentine?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. "Sheriff Vance," she acknowledged with relief. "This is Mr. Howard Blackwell from Boston, my former fiancé." Silas nodded curtly. "Mr. Blackwell." Howard looked Silas up and down with undisguised disdain. "A local lawman. Penelope, really. Your associations have deteriorated dramatically." "I'd mind your tone in my town, sir," Silas said evenly. "Miss Valentine is a respected businesswoman here." "She's a confused young woman who belongs in Boston," Blackwell countered. "And I have legal documents proving it." Over the next few days, tension gripped Whispering Creek as the standoff continued. Blackwell took a room at the Grand Hotel and made daily visits to the apothecary, alternating between threats and condescending appeals to what he called reason. He also visited Judge Morgan, presenting papers that he claimed gave him authority over Penelope's inheritance. Silas, meanwhile, sent telegrams to contacts in Boston, trying to verify Blackwell's claims while maintaining a visible presence near Penelope's shop. The town divided into factions, most supporting Penelope's right to independence, while others whispered that perhaps a respectable marriage to a wealthy man wasn't such a terrible fate. On the fourth evening after Blackwell's arrival, Penelope was closing her shop when Silas arrived looking grave. "I received a reply from Boston," he said once they were alone in her living quarters above the shop. "The attorney I contacted confirms that your father's will does include a provision regarding the inheritance and marriage." Penelope sank into a chair, her face pale. "So Howard was telling the truth?" "Partly," Silas clarified, taking her hand. "The provision states that if you remained unmarried for a year after your father's death, Howard Blackwell would become trustee of your inheritance. But there's nothing requiring you to marry him specifically." Understanding dawned in Penelope's eyes. "So if I were already married to someone else?" "Blackwell would have no claim," Silas confirmed. He hesitated, then knelt before her chair, still holding her hand. "Penelope, I know this isn't how either of us imagined this moment, but I need to ask you something." "Yes," she whispered, her heart suddenly racing. "I've grown to care for you deeply these past months," Silas said, his usually confident voice unsteady. "I believe you feel something for me as well. I had planned to court you properly, to give us time, but circumstances have forced my hand." He took a deep breath. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not just to solve this problem with Blackwell, but because I believe we could build a good life together." Tears filled Penelope's eyes as she placed her free hand against his cheek. "Yes," she said simply, "though I admit I'd imagined a different timeline as well." Silas smiled, rising to pull her gently to her feet and into his arms. After a moment's hesitation, he lowered his head and kissed her a tender, questioning touch that deepened as she responded. When they finally parted, Penelope rested her head against his chest. "Every woman in town has been waiting for that, you know," she murmured. "What?" Silas asked, confused. "Your kiss," she explained, looking up at him with a smile. "They've all been hoping to be the one to melt the stoic sheriff's reserve." Silas chuckled, touching her cheek gently. "Then I'm glad I saved it for you," he said softly before kissing her again. The following morning, Silas confronted Blackwell in the hotel dining room, presenting him with the telegrams from Boston and making it clear that Penelope would soon be his wife, rendering any claim to her inheritance void. "This is preposterous," Blackwell spluttered. "She can't possibly prefer a frontier lawman to the security I offer." "That's precisely what I prefer," said Penelope, who had entered behind Silas. I prefer a man who sees me as an equal, not a possession. A man who respects my choices rather than dismissing them as temporary madness." Blackwell looked between them, his face reddening with anger and embarrassment as hotel guests watched the confrontation with undisguised interest. "You'll regret this foolishness," he warned. "Playing at independence in this backward town. That's enough," Silas interrupted, his voice low but carrying authority that silenced the older man. "Miss Valentine has made her choice clear. I suggest you take the afternoon stage back to civilization, Mr. Blackwell." 2 weeks later, Whispering Creek witnessed the wedding of Sheriff Silas Vance and Penelope Valentine at the small white church on the edge of town. The entire community attended, including several young women who dabbed at tears as the handsome sheriff pledged himself to the auburn-haired apothecary. "I thought he'd never look twice at any woman," Mrs. Wallace whispered to her friend. "And then along comes Penelope Valentine with her books and her medicines and captures him completely." "They suit each other," replied Mrs. Miller with a satisfied nod. "Both too independent for their own good, but together, well, they make sense." As the newlyweds emerged from the church to a shower of flower petals, Silas paused on the steps, gazing down at his bride with unmasked affection. The crowd fell silent, somehow sensing a significant moment as the typically reserved sheriff bent to kiss his wife in full view of the town, a public declaration that left no doubt where his heart belonged. That evening, as they sat on the porch behind their new home, a small ranch house just outside town that Silas had quietly purchased weeks earlier, Penelope leaned against her husband's shoulder. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression as he looked at the stars. "That some things are worth waiting for," Silas replied, drawing her closer. "All those years wandering from town to town, never staying, never connecting." He kissed her temple. "I was looking for something without knowing what it was. And now," Penelope asked, turning to face him. "Now I've found it," he said simply, capturing her lips with his once more as the evening star rose over Whispering Creek, a beacon for travelers, a signal of constancy in a changing world, much like the love that had found them both far from where they began, but exactly where they needed to be.